Hello and welcome to this course on marketing analytics. In this lecture, I'll discuss about consumer behavior and marketing strategy. So you'll notice that I have combined two subjects together in this, and that's because marketing strategy is all about understanding consumer behavior and incentivizing it in such a way that firm and the consumer both win. I know a lot of marketers will be saying, but what about competitors? Are they not part of marketing strategy? And the answer is no, not really. In this case, the marketing strategy is solely focused on the customer. By understanding consumer behavior, part of that insight will come from what experience consumers have with competitors. But the focus is on consumer, not competitive behavior. But then, as a fair argument, product consumer centricity runs contrary to the product managers. Product managers focus on developing products and then finding consumers to buy them. Some examples are Apple or Google or companies like that. Marketing drives financial results, and in order to be marketing oriented, there must be a consumer-centric focus. The marketing concept does not mean giving the consumer only what they want, because the consumer's wants can be varied across different customer segments, different customer groups, different ethnicity, different types of customer. The consumer's want contradict the firm's minimal needs. And number three, the consumer might not know what they want. It is marketer's job to learn and understand and incentivize the customer behavior to a win-win position. The objection from product-centric marketers is that this sometimes works, like for example, if you are building a product and you want consumers to buy it, your approach becomes product driven and not consumer driven. So what happens in such cases is sometimes we end up building product that probably consumers would not have preferred or would not have wanted. So an example that is often given in this respect is Apple's iPhone or iPad. So just imagine if we had gone to the customer and asked them for what they want, they wouldn't have said that they want something like an iPad or an iPod, because they had no idea that such a thing can ever exist. In this regard, often a famous quote from Ford is circulated that if I had asked my customers what they want, they would have said a faster horse. But at that time, there was a technology change, there was a huge technology transformation, and probably people didn't know that what's possible. But that's not always true, and in most of the cases, the argument is customer centric and not product centric. So especially with new innovative product, consumers don't know what they expect because they have no experience with it. The second point is that not everyone has the genius of Ford or Steve Jobs for that matter, and they cannot always create something without taking the customer into confidence. Accordingly, in this lecture, we'll only focus on consumer centricity, and on the central of that is the consumer behavior. A simple view of consumer behavior is best understood in the microeconomic analysis of the consumer problem. This is generally summarized in three questions. What are consumers' preferences in terms of goods services? What are consumers' constraints, allocating limited budgets, or they have to do something or perform something, some task to get the product? And given limited sources, what are consumers' choices? This assumes that consumers are rational and have a desire to maximize their satisfaction. Let's talk about general assumptions of consumer preferences. The first is that preferences are complete, meaning consumers can compare and rank all products. The second assumption is that preferences are transitive. This is mathematical requirement that if a consumer is preferring a certain product and it is preferred to product Y, and then Y is preferred to Z, then that product is preferred to Z. The third assumption is that the products are desirable. A good is good or of value. This means that more is better, cost notwithstanding. A quick look into the assumptions above make it clear that they are made in order to do the mathematics. Ultimately, that means that curves will be produced that lend themselves to some graphics. This immediately leads us to using calculus for any analytic reasons. But this means that some heroic assumptions indeed are required, especially ceteris paribus. The decision process. Consumers go through a shopping purchasing process using decision analytics to come to a choice. It should be recognized that not all decisions are equally important or complex. Based on the risk of a wrong choice, either extended problem or solving or limited problem solving will tend to be used. Extended problem solving is when the cost of product is high, or the product will be lived with for a long time, or as the initial purchase, etc. Something about the choice requires more thought, evaluation, and rigor. Limited problem solving is of course the opposite, when products are inexpensive, short-lived, not really important, or with the low risk of wrong decision. Limited problem solving is used. In limited problem solving, the choice is more automatic. The choice is usually reduced to a rule, what experience the consumer has had before, what brand they have disliked, what price is low enough, what their neighbors have told them, etc. The typical decision process in terms of consumer behavior, for example, is about need recognition, search for information, information processing, alternative evaluation, purchase and post-purchase evaluation. There are marketing opportunities along each step to influence and incent. Need recognition. The initiator of consumer decision process is need recognition. This is a realization that there is a cognitive dissonance between some ideal state and the current state. There is much advertising around need arousal, from educating consumers on real needs to informing consumers about pseudo needs. Need arousal is where it starts. Then there is search for information. Now consumers recall what they have heard or what they know about the product to infer, depending on whether the product requires immediate or extensive engagement, an ability to make a decision. Obviously, advertising, and branding come into play here, informing consumers of the benefit, differentiation, etc. Information processing. The next step is for consumer to absorb what information they have and what facts they know. Most marketing messaging strategies prefer for consumers to not process information but to recall such things as positive brand exposure, satisfaction from previous interactions, or emotional loyalty. If consumers do not process information that is critically evaluate costs and benefits, then they can use brand equity satisfaction to make the shorthand decision. It is the job of marketing analytics to find those that are considering distinct from those that have already decided. Pre-purchase alternative evaluation. Now, after information has been processed, comes the critical final comparison. Does the potential product have attributes that the consumer considers greater than the consumer standards. That is, given budgetary standards, what is the product likely to offer in terms of satisfaction after the consumer has decided it is the minimum qualification, it is above the minimum qualifications. And then comes purchase. Finally, the whole point of making the funnel is purchase. A sale is the last piece. This is the decision of the consumer based on the shopping process described above. The actual purchase action carries within it all the above processes and all the actual and perceived product attributes. Post-purchase evaluation, that's the consumer decision process, does not end with purchase. Generally, it is a comparison with what the consumer thought would be utilization gained from consuming the product compared to what actual satisfaction was received from the product. That is, the creation of loyalty starts post-purchase. Now, with consumer behavior centrally located, let's think about a firm's strategy. Keep the differences between competitive moves and consumer behavior firmly in mind. Now, marketing is all about understanding and incentivizing consumer behavior in such a way that both the consumer and the firm get what they want. Consumers want a product that they need when they need it at a price that gives them value through a channel they prefer. Firms want loyalty, customer satisfaction, and growth. Since a market is a place where buyers and sellers meet, marketing is the function that moves the buyer and sellers towards each other. Given the above, it should be noted that marketing strategy has evolved to a firm versus firm rivalry. That is, marketing strategy is in danger of forgetting the focus on consumer behavior and jumping deep into something like game theory wherein one firm competes with another firm. Everything that follows about marketing strategy can be thought of as an indirect consequence of firm versus firm based on a direct consequence of focusing on consumer behavior. That is, fighting a firm means incentivizing consumers. Think of it as an iceberg where what is seen, that is firms competing, is the tip above the surface, but what is really happening that moves the iceberg is unseen from the firm's point of view below the surface, which is incentivizing consumers. Now let's get into the types of marketing strategy. Everyone should be aware of Michael Porter and his 5 forces. This is where marketing strategy became a discipline. First, Porter detailed factors creating competitive intensity. What are firms competing over? Consumer loyalty. These factors are the beginning powers of suppliers, the bargaining powers of suppliers, bargaining powers of buyers, threat of new entrants, the rivalry among existing firms, and the threat of substitute products. Bargaining power of buyers means firms lose profit from powerful buyers demanding lower prices. This means consumers are sensitive to price. The bargaining powers of suppliers means firms lose profit due to potential increased factor prices. Suppliers only have bargaining power because a firm's margins are low, because a firm cannot raise prices, because consumers are sensitive to price. Threat of new entrants, lower profits due to new competitors entering the market. Again, consumers are sensitive to price and very informed about other firms' offerings. The intensity of rivalry causes lower prices because of zero-sum games supplied by consumers. There are only a certain number of potential loyal customers, and if a firm gains one, then another firm loses that one. The threat of substitute products invites consumers to choose among the lower priced products. Note how all this strategy which appears like forms fighting other forms, is actually based on consumer behavior. Am I putting too fine a point on this? Maybe, but it does help us focus, right? Based on these factors, a firm can ascertain the intensity of competition. The more competitive the industry is, the more a firm must be price taker. That is, they have little market power, meaning little control over price. This affects the amount of profit each firm in the industry can expect. Given this, a firm can evaluate their strengths and weaknesses and decide how to compete or not. Porter then did a brilliant thing. He devised, based on the above three generic strategies, a firm can compete on cost, be the low-cost provider, a firm can be a differentiator and focus on high-end products, or a firm can segment and focus on smaller niche part of the market. The point is that the firm needs to create and adhere to a particular strategy. Often firms are diluted and do everything at once. Tracy and Wisima took Porter's framework and evolved it. They too came up with three strategies: operational excellence, basically a focus on lower cost; product leadership, a focus on higher end differentiated products; and customer intimacy, a differentiation segmentation strategy. You can see their use of extension of Porter's ideas. Both have the same bottom line: firms should be disciplined and concentrate their efforts corporate-wide on primarily one and only one strategic focus, applied to consumer behavior. Now we'll focus on some defensive reactions to competitor moves. Bypass attack. The attacking firm expands into one of our product areas, and the correct counter is for us to constantly explore new areas. Remember Theodore Levitt's marketing myopia? If not, reread it. You know you had to in school. Encirclement attack. The attacking firm tries to overpower us with larger forces, and the correct counter is to message how our products are superior, unique, and of more value. This requires a constant monitoring of message effectiveness. Flank attack. The attacking firm tries to exploit our weaknesses, and the correct counter is to not have any weaknesses. This again requires monitoring and messaging the uniqueness value of our products. Frontal attack. The attacking firm aims at our strengths, and the correct counter is to attack back in the firm's territory. Obviously, this is a rarely used technique. Offensive actions are new market segments. This uses behavioral segmentation and incents consumer behavior for a win-win relationship. Go-to-market approaches. This learns about consumers' preferences in terms of bundling, channels, buying plans, etc. Differentiating functionality. This approach extends consumers' needs by offering products and purchase combinations most compelling to potential customers. Now we'll get into a first marketing problem, determining the quantifying those things that drive demand. Marketing is about consumer behavior, which we have touched, but which I will have more to say later. And the point of marketing is about incentivizing consumers to purchase. These purchases, typically units, are what economists call demand. By the way, finance is more about supply, and the two together are supply and demand. Remember, back in beginning of economics. Before we dive into this problem at hand, it might be good to back up and give some simple definitions. There are two kinds of statistical techniques: dependent equation type and the interrelationship type. Dependent type statistics deal with explicit equations. Interrelationship techniques are not equations, but the variance between variables. These will be defined later, but are types of factor analysis and segmentation. Clearly, this current chapter is about equation. Deterministic versus probabilistic equations. Now let's talk about two kinds of equations, deterministic and probabilistic. Deterministic is algebraic, and the left side exactly equals right side. Profit equal to revenue minus expenses. If you know two of the quantities, you can algebraically solve for the third. This is not the kind of equations dealt with in statistics. Statistics deals with probabilistic equations like y equal to a plus bx plus e. Here, y is the dependent variable, a is the constant or intercept, x is some independent variable, b is the coefficient or slope, and e is the random error term. It is this random error term that makes this equation a probabilistic one. Y does not exactly a equal to bx because there is some random disturbance that must be accounted for. Think of this as y on average equals some intercept plus bx. Okay, say we have a guy, Scott, who is an analytic manager at PC manufacturing firm. Scott has a MS in economics and has been doing analytics for 4 years. He started mostly as a SAS programmer but has only recently been using statistical analysis to give insights to drive marketing science. Scott is called into his boss's office. His boss is a good strategist with a direct marketing background but is not well versed in economics or econometrics or analytics, etc. Scott, the boss, says we need to find a way to predict our unit sales. More than that, we need something to help us understand what drives our unit sales. Something that we can use as a lever to help increase sales over the quarter. A demand model, Scott says. Units are a function of what price advertising. Sure. Scott gulps and says, I'll see what I can do. That night he thinks about it and has some ideas. He will first have to think about causality, and then he will have to get appropriate data. It's smart to formulate a theoretic model first, regardless of what data you may or may not have. First, try to understand the data generating process. This is caused by that, maybe that, etc. And then see what data or proxies for data can be used to actually construct the model. It's also wise to hypothesize the signs of the variables you think significant in causing your dependent variable to vary. Remember that the dependent variable is dependent upon the independent variables. For instance, it's well known that price is probably a significant variable in a unit demand model and that the sign should be negative. That is, as price goes up, units on average should go down. This is the law of demand, the only law in all the economics except the one that most economists forecast will be wrong. So as we know, for most economic goods except the given goods, as the price goes up, demand goes down. So Scott thinks that price and advertising spend are important in generating demand. Also that there should be something about the season. He's on the consumer side of the business and it has strong back to school and Christmas seasonal spikes. He thinks he can easily get the number of units sold and the average price of those units. Seasonality is easy, it's just a variable to account for time of the year, say quarterly. Advertising spend might be a little tougher, but let's say he is able to twist some arms and eventually secure a guess as to the average amount of advertising spent on the consumer market by quarter. This will be a time series model since it has season and quarterly units, average prices, and advertising spend by time period quarterly. There will be some economic trick suggestions on the time series modeling in the technical section, particularly we'll discuss it pertaining to serial correlation. For now, let's make sure there is a good grasp of the problem. Scott will use a dependent variable technique called ordinary regression to understand how season, advertising spend, and price causes units sold. This is called structural analysis. He is trying to understand the structure of the data generating process. He is attempting to quantify how price, advertising spend, and season explain or cause the movement in unit sales. When he is through, he will be able to say whether or not advertising spend is significant in causing unit sales. He will have to make certain no advertisers are in earshot when he does, and when December is positive and January negative in terms of moving unit sales, etc. Now Scott is ready to design the ordinary regression model. Scott's model for his boss will use multiple regression because he has more than one independent variable. Output of the model will have estimates about how significant each variable is and whether it's significant or not. This is the heart of structural analysis, quantifying the structure of the demand for PCs. So Scott collected data and ran the model, units equal to price plus advertising, and now he sees how the model fits. There is one general measure of goodness of fit, R-square. R-square is the square of correlation coefficient. In this case, the correlation of actual units are predicted units. While correlation measures strength and direction, R-square measures shared variance and ranges from 0 to 100%. And now let's talk about significance, shall we? In marketing, we operate at 95% confidence. Remember Z-scores. 1.96 is the Z-score for 95% confidence, which is same as p-value, which is smaller than 0.05. So if a t-ratio, which in this case is the coefficient divided by the standard error, is greater than 1.96, the variable is considered significant.